After my crankcase cover is installed, my next step is to install the cylinder head on top of the engine block. In order to do this, you need to install your head gasket. Make sure that the head gasket is lined up the correct way. Before you install it, make sure all 4 bolt holes line up, and the head gasket should be turned so that this hole lines up with this hole in the engine block. Once the cylinder head gasket is in place, you can take your cylinder head and you're going to line up the cylinder head with this dowel. Once the head is in place, you can install the 4 bolts that hold the head onto the engine block. You have one here, 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 and here. The 4 cylinder head bolts are going to be torqued down with a torque wrench, and on the bottom 2 bolts you may need an extension and a socket to reach in to tighten them up. When your 4 bolts are snugged up, you're going to use the torque wrench, and according to our torque specifications chart, I've highlighted in pink the cylinder head bolts need to be torqued to 22 foot-pounds. When you tighten these bolts up with the torque wrench, you're going to go in a crisscross pattern. So I'm going to tighten this bolt, then I will tighten this bolt. I'll move back up to the top and tighten this bolt, and then finally tighten this bolt last. So I'm going in a crisscross pattern. Again, make sure the torque wrench clicks, and that means that you have reached your desired 22 foot-pounds. After your cylinder head bolts are tight, you're going to install the push rods. We have an intake and exhaust push rod. These are both the same length, so it doesn't matter which side you put it in. And to put these in, we need to loosen up these adjusting bolts on top of the rocker arms. To do that, you'll need a 9mm wrench and a screwdriver. You're going to loosen up these nuts and back off the adjusting bolt as far as it can go. Install the push rods. You may need to push down on the valve in order to get the push rod underneath the adjusting bolt. My next step is to adjust the clearance between the rocker arm and the valve stem. So using these adjusting nuts and a feeler gauge, proper gap between the valve and the rocker arm. We want to adjust our intake valve between 5 and 7 thousandths of an inch clearance. Our exhaust valve is going to be 7 to 9 thousandths clearance. Our intake valve is going to be adjusted first, which is on the carburetor side, and using our feeler gauge, we are going to find 5 thousandths of an inch, or 0.005. To adjust our rocker arms, we'll need a screwdriver and a 9mm wrench. First thing you want to do is loosen up the jam nut on the rocker arm and loosen this bolt. Once that is loose, we'll take our 5 thousandths of an inch feeler gauge and place it between the rocker arm and the valve stem. You are going to tighten up the bolt until you feel a little bit of resistance in between the valve stem and the rocker arm. Once there's a little resistance, you will hold the screwdriver so it doesn't turn and tighten up the lock nut. After you've tightened your lock nut, double check the clearance so that it is 5 thousandths of an inch. Our next step is to adjust the exhaust valve clearance, and this is between 7 and 9 thousandths of an inch. The clearance on the exhaust valve is wider because the exhaust valve gets hotter than the intake valve and it expands more. Once you have located the 8 thousandths of an inch feeler gauge, you are going to place it between the valve stem and the rocker arm and gently tighten up the bolt. As you tighten, keep wiggling the feeler gauge until you feel a slight resistance between the valve stem and the rocker arm. Once there's resistance, hold the screwdriver still and tighten up your lock nut. Once it's been adjusted, double check it. And now we're ready to install our valve cover. Before I adjusted the valves, I made sure that the piston was at top dead center. That way neither intake or the exhaust valve were open during this. I'm going to remove my 4 bolts. After the gasket's in place, I want to make sure that my valve cover is clean, free of any gasket material, and simply bolt this back on. You want to make sure the bolt with the wire clip is located in the top right hole. Once your valve cover bolts are snug, we're going to use a torque wrench and tighten the 4 valve cover bolts to 52 inch-pounds. According to our torque specification sheet, our valve cover mating bolts should be torqued between 52 and 86 inch-pounds. After our 4 valve cover bolts are snug, we're going to use our torque wrench set at 52 inch-pounds along with our 10mm socket and extension and tighten it until the torque wrench clicks. Notice I am tightening these in a crisscross pattern to make sure that I do not over tighten them. After the valve cover is installed, my next step is to install the flywheel.